She stood outside the boardroom door, 7 months pregnant, back aching. She came to surprise her husband for lunch. Then she heard it. His voice, his colleagues, talking about her. Not by her name, not by her doctorate, not by the research that had changed how 3 universities taught economics. Just Grant's wife. And then one word that cracked her world open. Before. As in, she was smart. Before the wedding, before the pregnancy, before she became, what exactly? She waited for her husband to correct them. She waited. He said, "Sylvia, can you pull the Luxembourg file?" That was all. She walked back to the elevator, rode down 42 floors, sat in the car, hands in her lap. She checked her phone, locked it, unlocked it, locked it again. There was no one to call yet, because she didn't have the full shape of it yet. She only had the edges. And one word, following her through every room of a house that had her husband's name on everything and hers on nothing. Before. What happens when the most brilliant woman in the room has spent 2 years pretending she isn't? What happens when a man who manages everything finally meets the woman he could never manage? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, her name will leave an entire boardroom speechless, and you will never forget why. This is a story about what it costs to make yourself small for someone who was never worth the sacrifice, and what it feels like to finally take yourself back.
The click of heels on marble. That was the sound of the 42nd floor. Clara knew it by heart now. 2 years of waiting in reception areas. 2 years of learning which elevator was fastest, which bathroom had the good soap, which conference room caught afternoon light through the east windows. She knew this building the way you know a place you visit but never own. She was 7 months pregnant. Her back ached. She had taken a car across town to surprise her husband for lunch. Simple, ordinary, the kind of thing a wife does on a Tuesday. She heard voices before she reached the door. The conference room glass was frosted. The door was cracked open 2 inches. She didn't intend to stop. She stopped because she heard her name. Not her name exactly. Grant's wife. That was how Sylvia said it. Not Clara, not Mrs. Whitfield, not Dr. Whitfield, which no one here had ever called her. Just Grant's wife. The way you label a folder, the way you categorize something that belongs to something else. Then a voice she didn't immediately recognize. Male, older, Crawford, maybe? One of the board members with silver hair and an opinion about everything. "Pretty girl," Crawford said. "Quiet." "Yes," Sylvia replied. The way she said yes, long, layered, like a word doing 2 jobs at once. "Smart?" Crawford asked. A pause. Not a short pause, a considered pause. The pause of someone deciding how honest to be. "She was," Sylvia said. "I think. Before. Clara put one hand against the wall. The marble was cold through her palm. Cold and solid, and very real. Her baby shifted inside her. A slow rolling movement. The way she moved when something changed in the environment. As if she too had heard that word and was deciding what to make of it. Before. The implication was not subtle. Before Grant. Before the wedding. Before the pregnancy. Before she became... what, exactly? Decorative. Managed. Comfortable furniture in a very expensive house. She waited for Grant's voice. She waited for him to say something. To say anything. To say, "Actually, my wife has a doctorate from Georgetown. My wife published research that 3 universities built curriculum around. My wife is the most precise thinker I have ever met in 20 years of building companies." She waited. Grant said, "Sylvia, can you pull the Luxembourg file?" That was all. The Luxembourg file. Clara stood in the corridor with her hand against cold marble, and her unborn daughter turning slowly inside her, and she understood something, not the full shape of it yet, just the edges, the way you understand a thing before you can name it. She turned around. She walked back to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood and waited, and the elevator came, and she rode it down 42 floors, in a building she could not find her name anywhere in, married to a man whose name was on everything. The lobby was bright. The doorman nodded. The car was waiting at the curb. She got in. She did not tell the driver to go anywhere. She sat. Her hands were in her lap. Her wedding ring caught light from the lobby glass. A small, precise point of light. She looked at it. She checked her phone, locked it, unlocked it, locked it again, unlocked it, locked it. There was no one to call yet. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't have words for it yet because she didn't have the full shape of it yet. She only had the edges. Before, she looked at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back was well-dressed, well-rested, her hair done, her coat expensive, the picture of a woman who was being well taken care of. Clara Whitfield, Grant Whitfield's wife. The car was very quiet. The baby moved again, not rolling this time. A distinct kick. Once, Clara put both hands over her stomach. "I know," she said softly. She didn't say what she knew. She couldn't say it yet. She just knew it the way your body knows things before your mind catches up. The driver said, "Mrs. Whitfield, did you want to head home?" She looked at him in the rearview mirror. Young, kind face. He drove her 3 times a week and always had the seat adjusted correctly. "Yes," she said. "Home." She looked out the window as the city moved past. All those buildings, all those windows, all those lives happening in parallel. How many women were sitting in the backs of cars right now? Hands folded in their laps, understanding something they weren't ready to name. She thought, too many. She thought, I was so willing. That's the part that will haunt me, not what he did, what I was willing for. She caught herself. Not yet. Not the full accounting yet. She needed to be somewhere quiet first. She needed the full shape of it before she could look at it directly. The car moved through the city. The afternoon light came in at an angle, golden, October light, the kind that makes everything look valuable and temporary at the same time. The house was empty when she got home. 12,000 square feet, 4 floors, a view of the park from every room on the north side, decorated by a firm that charged more per hour than most people made in a week. Beautiful in the way that rooms are beautiful when no one lives in them. Curated, controlled. She walked through it. Living room, library, kitchen, the breakfast room with its French doors to the garden, the formal dining room used twice a year, the study that was supposed to be hers and had somehow filled up with Grant's overflow files. She had watched it happen, box by box. She had even helped. She had said, "Oh, it's fine. I'm not using it much right now anyway." Right now, 2 years ago. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She stood at the counter and drank it while it was still too hot because she needed something concrete. Something that required her attention. The small specific pain of too hot tea on her tongue was useful. It kept her present. Before, she had a career. Not a hobby, not a pastime, a career. Behavioral economics. The science of why intelligent people make decisions that work against their own interests. The invisible architecture of choice. She had spent 6 years in doctoral research and another 4 in the field before she met Grant. She had been good at it. Demonstrably, specifically, measurably good. She had published work that people cited, that people built on, that had real-world applications in corporate policy and public health and financial regulation. And then she had paused. For the wedding. Then for the settling in. Then because Grant's schedule was demanding and someone needed to manage the household. Then because she was pregnant and tired. Then because she had been still so long the momentum had quietly died. 2 years. She set down her tea. 2 years is not a pause. 2 years is a decision. She had just never made it consciously. She had made it the way you lose a day, by not watching where the hours go. Her phone rang. Grant. She looked at the screen for 2 full seconds before answering. "Hey," he said, his voice warm, easy, the voice of a man whose afternoon had gone well. "I heard you came by." "I did," she said. "You were in a meeting. I didn't want to interrupt." "You should have come in." Easy warmth, genuine, even. That was the complicated part. It was always genuine. You know you're always welcome. She looked at her reflection in the kitchen window. The woman there was very calm, composed, good posture. She looked like a woman who was fine. "Of course," she said. "Next time?" She hung up. She stood at the counter. God, she thought, I was so willing. For 2 years I was so willing. The signs were everywhere, and I just kept walking through them. Kept adjusting. Kept saying it's fine, it's temporary, it's not what it looks like. But it was exactly what it looked like. She knew that now. The tea had gone cold, bitter, the way things go when you stop paying attention to them. She poured it down the drain. She started noticing the pattern the way you notice a crack in plaster. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and then you cannot remember not seeing it. And you wonder how long it was there before you looked. She began keeping a mental record. Not written, not yet, just paying attention in a way she had stopped paying attention, using the part of her brain that she had let go soft from disuse. Dinner with the Hargroves, old family friends of Grant's, 8 people around a table that cost more than her first car. The conversation turned to Federal Reserve policy. Clara had an opinion. It was a good opinion. She knew it was a good opinion because she had spent 3 years publishing research that led directly to it. She began to say it. Grant began speaking before she finished. Not over her, not exactly, just... He started talking before the last word left her mouth. His voice was louder, without being raised, more confident without trying to be. The table turned toward him, the way rooms always turn toward Grant, like flowers toward light. Clara finished her sentence inside her own head. She noticed this. She filed it. The following weekend, a charity gala. Diane, Grant's mother, introducing Clara to a senator's wife named Georgina. Georgina had quick eyes, the eyes of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms full of important people and had learned to read them in seconds. "This is Clara," Diane said. Warm smile, pearls, the scent of expensive powder. "She keeps our Grant very happy. Not she was a researcher, not she has a doctorate, not she published work that changed how 3 major corporations structure their employee incentive programs. She keeps our Grant very happy." Clara smiled. She shook Georgina's hand. She said, "Lovely to meet you." Georgina held her hand a half-second longer than necessary. Her eyes did something. A small, precise flicker. Clara wondered if Georgina saw it. The way a person could be present in a room and absent from it at the same time. The way a woman could be introduced as an accessory by the people who were supposed to be her family. She filed this too. She told Bet, not everything, not yet, but enough to say it out loud and hear what it sounded like. Bet's apartment was deliberately small, deliberately cluttered with books and mismatched furniture and a cat named Gerald who had opinions about everyone. It was the opposite of the Whitfield house, and Clara always breathed differently there. More air, more room. She sat cross-legged on the couch with takeout cartons between them and said, "It's not dramatic. That's what's hard to explain. If he shouted at me, I would know what to do. But it's this slow erosion, like water on stone." Bet ate noodles with complete focus. The focus she got when she was thinking something she hadn't decided to say yet. How long? She asked. I don't know. Maybe a year, maybe from the beginning, and I was just too... Claire stopped. Too in love to see it, Bet said. Too willing, Clara said. I keep coming back to that word. I was willing. I participated. I can't make him the whole villain because I kept walking through the door he held open. Betty put down her noodles. She looked at Clara directly. You know what that is? She said. That's what happens when someone does this long enough. You start carrying their guilt. You start managing their culpability, as if the right amount of self-blame will balance the ledger. Clara was quiet. He didn't do it on purpose, she said. I don't think he even knows, Clara. Bet's voice was very gentle. Does it matter? The room was quiet. Gerald the cat walked across the back of the couch and sat down behind Clara's head. No, Clara said slowly. I guess it doesn't. The effect is the same either way. The effect is the same either way, Betty repeated. That's the sentence. The next morning, Clara started reading again. Not officially, not publicly, just in the early mornings, before Grant woke up, before the household machinery of the day began. She sat in what was supposed to be her study, and she opened journals she had let go unread for 2 years. She read papers that cited her own work, her name in the footnotes of other people's thinking. She read about where her field had gone while she was somewhere else. The relief of it was physical. She felt something unknot in her chest, something that had been clenched for a very long time. This is still here, she thought. This is still mine. She had been afraid, without letting herself admit the fear, that 2 years had emptied her, that she would reach back for herself and find nothing, that the person who had stood at a podium in Chicago and commanded a room of 200 economists was gone for good. But she was there, a little quieter, a little more careful, but present, like a fire that had been banked but not extinguished. She just had to give it air. Prenatal appointment. Dr. Forsyth's office. The particular smell of a doctor's office. Something clinical underneath something floral. The combination that means someone is trying. Dr. Forsyth listened to the heartbeat, measured, typed notes. Her manner was efficient without being cold, the manner of someone who had delivered enough babies to understand that this moment, ordinary to her, was enormous to the person on the table. Is there anything I should be doing differently? Clara asked. I've been more sedentary than I'd like. Dr. Forsyth looked up. Walks, she said. Short ones, and don't let anyone convince you to rest, just because you're pregnant. She paused. You're not sick. You're building something. Building something. Clara drove home with those 2 words sitting in her chest like warmth. She had been treating this pregnancy as a limitation, as a reason to pause, to wait, to defer, one more reason to put herself off, one more reason the right time was later. But Dr. Forsyth was right. She was building something, maybe more than one thing. She turned the car toward home and thought, starting over feels impossible, but staying feels worse, and I am done with worse. It was the first time she had let herself think that sentence clearly. It did not feel like a decision yet. It felt like the moment before a decision. The moment when the mind finally stops protecting you from what it already knows. The memories came at night. Grant was traveling, Dallas, some acquisition. The house was its particular empty kind of full, all the furniture and art and light fixtures in exactly their correct places, nothing out of order, nothing personal. She lay in bed, and she let herself remember, not fighting it, not the way she had been fighting it for months, keeping busy, keeping forward, keeping her eyes on the immediate practical thing in front of her. just lying in the dark and letting the memories come like water through a door she had been holding closed. Chicago. 4 years ago. She was 31. She was presenting at the National Behavioral Economics Symposium. 8 months of preparation, 400 pages of notes compressed into 40 minutes. She had checked every data point 3 times. She had rehearsed the talk until the words felt like her own breath. She stood at the podium and said the first sentence. And then something happened that she had only felt a handful of times in her life. The room went with her. Not politely, not the way audiences attend when they are being courteous, genuinely, actively with her. She was funny at the right moments, precise at the others. A man in the third row, gray suit, aggressive posture, asked a hostile question. She answered it without flinching, without apology, without the particular verbal softening she had been trained since girlhood to apply to any statement that might make someone uncomfortable. She just answered it, directly, completely, and sat down. 2 people started clapping before she had finished her final sentence. Afterward, Arthur Calloway waited until the crowd thinned. He was 61 then, the kind of man who had been in his field long enough to stop needing to perform authority. He simply had it. He walked up to her and shook her hand. That was the best talk of the day, he said. Just like that. No preamble. They had dinner. He offered her a research partnership. She spent 2 weeks considering it. She did not accept, because by then she had met Grant. And she was 31 and in love, and she had thought she was choosing love over ambition. She had not yet understood that those 2 things are not opposites. She had not yet understood that real love does not ask you to choose. She had thought she was choosing. She had been deferring. She sat up in the dark. The bedroom was quiet. The park outside was quiet. The whole enormous house was quiet. She was so good. She knew it without arrogance. She had been demonstrably, specifically, publicly good at something that mattered. She had spent years studying why intelligent people make decisions that betray themselves. She had written papers about it. And then she had lived one. The irony had been funny, briefly, around month 3. It had stopped being funny sometime in year 2. She went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her wrists, a thing she had done since college when she needed to clear her head. The cold was useful. It brought her back to the present body, the present moment, the present woman. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was different from the one who had looked back 2 years ago. Not worse, not better, just different in ways that were hard to catalog. Something behind the eyes had changed, a quality of attention. You're still here, she thought. You were always still here. You are still the woman who stood at that podium. You just forgot to be her. She thought about her daughter, the one who kicked at night and went still during music, and had her own rhythms that Claire was learning to read. What am I showing her? That a woman makes herself small so a man can feel large? That you trade your name for his and call it love? Not this child. This child would know her mother. Not the managed version, not the before and after version. The actual woman, the one in the mirror. She nodded at her own reflection. The lemon cake. She hadn't made it in 2 years. She had to look up the recipe, which was its own small grief. She used to know it by heart. Her grandmother's recipe, handwritten on a card that had been through so many kitchens, it was soft at the edges. She found it in a box she had never fully unpacked. The box she had marked personal, miscellaneous, and pushed to the back of a closet when they moved in. A box of the things that were hers before. She carried it to the kitchen. She measured flour. She zested lemons. The kitchen filled with a smell that was not the Whitfield house at all. It was Ohio. It was a smaller house with a different kind of light. It was Sunday mornings, before she understood that Sunday mornings could be anything other than easy. Her grandmother's kitchen had been yellow. The smell of lemon zest and warm oven. the specific sound of a screen door. A woman who ran everything quietly and made it look like simply living. The baby was still while she baked. Content. The most still she had been all day. Clara whispered to her while she stirred. Your great-grandmother made this cake for every person she loved, when they were sick, when they were heartbroken, when they had something to celebrate and didn't want to make a fuss about it. She folded in the egg whites, slowly, carefully. She was the most competent person I ever knew. She managed everything. Her house, her garden, the whole fabric of the community around her. And she did it without ever raising her voice or asking for recognition. She paused. I used to think that was a limitation. I used to think she deserved more visibility, more credit. She looked at the batter turning in the bowl. I understand now that it was a choice. She didn't need the room to turn toward her. She knew what she was worth. There's a difference. The oven was warm. She slid the pan in. She sat at the kitchen counter and watched the light through the oven window. The cake rising slowly, patient, reliable. The chemistry of it working exactly as it was supposed to. She thought about what she was worth. Not what Grant thought she was worth. Not what the Whitfield machine had categorized her as. What she actually was. She deserved better than this. That was not a question. That was a fact. A simple, flat, uncontestable fact. She deserved better, and she was going to give herself better. Not revenge, something larger, something that outlasted revenge. She was going to rebuild. She found it by accident. She was looking for the car insurance documents, a claim she had been meaning to file for 3 weeks. Something minor, a scratch in the parking garage. The other driver had left a note. She had put the paperwork somewhere sensible and couldn't remember where sensible was. She went to Grant's home office, the filing cabinet, third drawer from the top. The insurance folder was not where it should have been. She checked the drawer above, the drawer below, the lateral cabinet, against the wall. She found a folder marked with her initials, CRW, Clara Rose Whitfield. She assumed it was administrative. Investment documents, maybe. Something related to her own accounts. She opened it. It took her 45 seconds to understand what she was looking at. The original prenuptial agreement she remembered. She had reviewed it with her own lawyer before the wedding. It had been fair, standard. She had signed it without concern. But this was not the original. This was an addendum, dated 8 months after the wedding. Signed by Grant, not by Clara. She read it twice, then a third time. The language was careful and dense and layered in the specific way of documents designed to obscure their function. But she was a researcher who had spent her career reading dense language. The addendum said this: if the marriage dissolved within the first 5 years, and if Clara had been, in the phrasing of the document, primarily non-employed, meaning financially dependent on Grant's household income, then her classification under the original asset division changed, substantially, in ways that would cost her a very great deal. He had this drawn up without telling her. 8 months into their marriage. At the same time, he was saying, take a break, take a year. Let yourself settle into our life. You don't have to rush back to work. She sat down on the floor, her back against the filing cabinet, her legs out in front of her hands in her lap, holding the document with the steadiness of someone who has gone past the shaking stage. He made me dependent, she thought. And then he built a legal mechanism for what that dependence would cost me. He did not love me. He managed me. She heard Bet's voice. Does it matter whether it was conscious? No. The effect is the same either way. The office was completely quiet. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, the kind that shows every particle of dust in the air. Millions of small things drifting. She watched them. She was past crying. She was in that space past tears, where everything becomes very cold and very precise. I was managed, she thought, from the beginning. The career conversations, the very gentle, very warm, very consistent pressure to make myself smaller and more dependent and more manageable. And I was so willing. The baby kicked hard once. Clara put her hand on her stomach. I know, she said. Her voice did not shake. She photographed every page of the addendum, front and back. Then she put the folder back exactly as she had found it. She closed the drawer. She smoothed the front of her clothes. She walked to the kitchen. She poured a glass of water. She drank it slowly while standing at the counter. Then she picked up her phone and called Harriet Cole. Harriet was her attorney, not a divorce attorney, her own attorney, the woman who had reviewed the original prenuptial. Sharp, unhurried, the kind of professional who did not perform busyness. Harriet, Clara said when she answered, I need to see you this week. I've found something you need to look at. A pause. How soon? Harriet asked. Tomorrow, Clara said. If you can. I can, Harriet said. Clara hung up. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the view of the park. The trees were past peak color now, bare branches beginning to show through the gold and orange, the skeleton of things becoming visible. She felt, underneath the cold precision, something else beginning to form. Not rage yet. Rage was coming. She could feel it building the way weather builds. The particular pressure in the air before a storm. But first, she needed to think clearly. She was a behavioral economist. She understood information asymmetry. She understood that the person who controls what is known controls the situation. Right now, Grant believed she knew nothing. That was her advantage. She was going to be very careful with it. Harriet's office the following afternoon, wood paneling, good light, the smell of real paper and old books. The comfortable seriousness of a space where important things were handled without drama. Harriet reviewed the addendum without expression. This was something Clara had always respected about her. She processed without performing. This is irregular, Harriet said finally. Amendments to prenuptial agreements require mutual consent from both parties to be enforceable under state law. If you didn't sign it, and you clearly didn't, it likely has no legal standing. Likely, Clara said. There may be arguments about implied knowledge, that you were aware of changed circumstances. Harriet set down the document. Did you know about this? No. I believe you. The question is whether we can demonstrate that cleanly. Clara reached into her bag. She set a folder on Harriet's desk. I kept every email from the first 18 months of the marriage, she said. Personal and household. I have documentation of when I stopped receiving professional correspondence and started receiving household management communications. I have a timeline of the career conversations. Every time he suggested I pause, take a break, not rush back. Harriet looked at the folder, then at Clara. Something moved in her eyes, a professional recognizing another professional. You've been building a record, she said. I've been building a record, Clara said. I didn't know what I was building it for, but I'm a researcher. Documentation is how I think. Harriet allowed herself a very small smile. All right, she said. Let's talk about what we do next. She did not tell Grant. This was the discipline. She had the information. He did not know she had it. She was going to be very careful about how and when that changed. She watched him across dinner tables and in morning conversations with new eyes. Not angry eyes, not yet, but precise ones. The eyes of a researcher who has identified a subject and is observing without intervention. Grant was not a bad man. This was the part that made the anger more complex, not less. He was warm, funny sometimes, generous in ways that were genuine. When he paid attention to you, his full attention, It still felt like standing in sunlight, but sunlight and warmth were not the same thing. She watched how he talked about her. At a dinner with his college friends, 8 people, easy conversation, the question came up, "What are you working on?" One couple was renovating a house, another was starting a company. One man had just published a book. It came around to Clara. "Clara keeps busy," Grant said, easy, warm, the tone of a man proud of a well-tended garden. Clara keeps busy. Not that Clara is a behavioral economist currently considering a research partnership with Callaway Institute. Not Clara's work has been cited in 47 academic papers in the last 2 years. Just Clara keeps busy. The sentence you say about a person whose activities are pleasant and not particularly important. Clara smiled. She picked up her wine glass. She filed it. The anger was building the way water builds behind a dam. Steady, accumulating. She was not ready to release it yet because she needed it to be useful, not explosive. Explosive anger does damage and then dissipates. Useful anger builds things. She called Bet on a Tuesday morning. Bet answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant Clara understood that Bet Ibaidiso had been waiting for this call without saying so. "I need to talk to someone who still knows what I'm capable of," Clara said. Bete exhaled, long and slow, like someone releasing a breath they had been holding for months. Finally, she said, "Don't." "I'm not saying I told you so," Bet said. "I'm saying thank God. I was starting to think you'd lost the receipt for yourself." Clara laughed. It came out a little broken at the edges. "I'm scared," she said, "that I've been gone too long, that I've been quiet so long, I don't know how loud I can be anymore." "Do you remember Chicago?" Bet asked. Clara closed her eyes. "Yes." "The woman in Chicago is not gone," Bet said. "She's been waiting in the hallway, very patiently, and she is done waiting." Clara sat with that for a moment. "I'm not the same as I was then," she said. "No," Beatty agreed. "You're better. You were brilliant then. Now you're brilliant, and you understand things about human behavior that you couldn't have learned from a book." "From my own marriage." "From your own marriage," Bet said, not unkindly. "That's research, the most expensive kind." She started making calls. Not confrontational calls, not dramatic calls. She started reconnecting. Carefully, quietly. An email to a former colleague she had genuinely liked, just checking in. The woman, Patricia, brilliant, relentless, replied within an hour with 3 questions about Clara's work and an invitation to a research roundtable the following month. She subscribed again to the journals she had let lapse. She reread 2 papers she had published before the marriage. They were good. She had forgotten how good they were. She found a paper published 4 months ago. The author had built directly on her doctoral research. Her name was in the citations 3 times. 3 times in one paper, she was still there. Her work was still there. It had been living and growing without her. She didn't have to start over. She had to start again. Different thing entirely. Starting over means from nothing. Starting again means from everything you already are. She wrote that in the margin of the paper. Then she looked at Arthur Callaway's contact information. Still saved. 4 years. She had moved it from phone to phone the way you move certain books. Not because you're reading them, but because you're not ready to let them go. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. Then she dialed. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Clara Whitfield," he said, before she could speak. And then, "I hoped you'd call eventually." She blinked. "You remember me." "I follow the citations," he said simply. "Your work keeps appearing in other people's research. Good work doesn't disappear just because the person stops publishing." She stood at the kitchen window, The park was gray and bare, and beautiful. The kind of beautiful that requires the leaves to be gone. "I've been away 2 years," she said. "I know," he said. We all noticed. A pause. "Are you coming back?" he asked. She exhaled. "I'm working on it," she said. "Yeah, good," he said. "I have a project that has been waiting for the right person for 18 months. It is specifically in your area, and I have not found the right person because the right person is you." She pressed her hand flat against the window glass. Cold, solid. "Tell me," she said. He told her. By the end of the conversation, her notepad was covered in the fast compressed script she used when she was thinking quickly. Her handwriting from when she was fully herself. She had not seen it in 2 years. She was smiling. She realized it because her face felt different. Not the managed smile of events and dinners. The actual one. The one she forgot she had. "I'm not crazy," she thought. "I know exactly who I am. I know what I'm capable of. And I am done pretending otherwise." Preston Whitfield called on a Thursday afternoon. She had never fully figured out Grant's older brother. He was quieter than Grant. He had his father's eyes and his mother's cheekbones, and none of the Whitfield confidence. Or rather, he had a different kind of confidence. The kind that didn't need the room to know it was there. "Clara," he said, "are you free for coffee? Just us." She chose the place. Deliberately, not a Whitfield-adjacent restaurant. A small Italian place, in a neighborhood neither of them usually went to. Good coffee. No one who would report back. Preston wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her directly. "I want to say something," he said. "And I want you to hear it as exactly what it is. I'm not delivering a message from Grant. I'm not positioning for anything. I'm just saying something that should have been said." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have watched my brother manage people his entire life," Preston said. "People he loves, people who are important to him. He genuinely doesn't know he does it. I want to be honest about that because I think you deserve honesty." He paused. "Our father was the same. He loved our mother completely, and he spent 40 years managing her and never once understood what it cost her." Clara looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are clearly not going to be managed," he said. "And I want to be on record when things change, and they will change, as having been honest with you." She studied his face. He met her gaze without flinching. "What do you know, Preston?" He held the eye contact. "I know that my brother has made plans without consulting you. I know that Sylvia has been operating in a capacity that goes beyond her job description. And I know that whatever you're building," his eyes moved briefly to the notepad she always carried now, "you should build it quickly." The air in the small restaurant was warm and smelled of espresso. "Are you telling me to protect myself?" she said. "I'm telling you," Preston said carefully, "that I watched my mother discover at 63 that 40 years of her life had been administered without her knowledge, and it destroyed something in her that never fully came back." He set down his cup. "I would rather not watch that happen again." She was quiet. "How's the baby?" he asked. The shift was deliberate, giving her room. "Strong," Clara said. "We're both strong." Preston smiled, a genuine one, the first she had seen from a Whitfield in longer than she could remember. "Good," he said. "Stay that way." She met with Harriet again the following week. Harriet spread documents across the conference table with the efficient pleasure of someone who liked having all the pieces in front of them. "The addendum is not enforceable," she said. "Unilateral amendments require mutual consent. In the absence of your signature, it's essentially a document that tells us about intent but has no legal standing." Clara exhaled. "But," Harriet said, Clara had been waiting for the but. If Grant believes it has teeth, he may act as though it does, preemptively. Asset reorganization, transfers, structural changes to holdings. We should have a complete financial picture before any of that happens. I've been going through the quarterly statements, Clara said. She opened her own folder. I spent 6 years studying corporate financial structures. I know what I'm looking at. Harriet looked at her across the table. You've already started, she said. I started the day after I found the addendum, Clara said. I've identified 3 holding structures established in the past 18 months that weren't in the original portfolio when we married. Harriet's expression was controlled, professional, and underneath both of those things, impressed. Send me what you have, she said. Already in your inbox, Clara said. I sent them this morning. Harriet opened her laptop. She looked at the email. She scrolled through the HHs of attached documents. She looked up. Clara, she said. You're very good at this. I know, Clara said simply. It was the first time in 2 years she had said those words without softening them. They sat in the air, between the 2 women, like something released. Geek, she told Grant at dinner. Not a question, not a request, a statement. He was eating. She set down her fork. I've accepted a consulting project with Callaway Research, she said. It begins next month. Grant looked up. Oh? His voice was carefully warm, recalibrating beneath the warmth. She could hear the machinery of it. With the baby due soon. The baby is due in 6 weeks, she said. The project begins in 8. I've planned accordingly. Clara. His voice shifted to the gentle, the parental, the tone he used when he was certain he knew better. You don't need to work. The stress alone. I'm not doing it because I need to, she said. Her voice was completely level. I'm doing it because I'm good at it. And being good at something is not stress. It is the opposite of stress. He was quiet. We should talk about this. I've told you, she said. That's the conversation. She picked up her fork. She returned to her meal. Grant sat across from her, and she could feel the recalibration happening, the reassessment. He was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you understood and are now not sure about. She did not help him with it. She ate her dinner. The table was quiet. Outside, the park was dark. The chandelier above them cast warm light on expensive plates and 2 people who had been looking at each other for 2 years, and perhaps, she thought, never seeing each other clearly. Somewhere along the way I became invisible, she thought. But the interesting thing about becoming invisible is that you can also see people very clearly when they can't see you. And I have seen everything. 3 in the morning. She could not sleep. The baby's positioning. The thoughts that would not quiet. The low, persistent ache in her back that had become a permanent resident. She went to the nursery. She had painted it herself. Pale yellow. Not the pink Diane had suggested. Tasteful, classic, appropriate. Not the gender-neutral gray the decorator had recommended. Yellow because her grandmother's kitchen was yellow and light came in the windows, and everything felt possible in that room. She sat in the rocking chair. The room was dark, except for the small nightlight she had installed. A crescent moon, soft white. The kind of light that made everything look like it was held carefully. She sat for a long time without speaking. Then she talked to her daughter. I've been thinking about what I want you to know, she said softly. And I've been going back and forth about whether I should be honest or whether I should protect you. She rocked slightly. The chair creaked once, then settled into its rhythm. I'm going to be honest. We've had enough of the alternative. She folded her hands over her stomach. I made myself small, she said. I did it gradually, so I didn't notice when it was happening. And I told myself it was love. I told myself 100 different versions of the same story. That I was choosing, that I was happy, that everything was fine. The crescent moon nightlight glowed. The room was absolutely still. But love doesn't ask you to disappear. Real love makes room. Real love asks you to show up fully. All of you, not the version that's convenient. If someone asks you to shrink, even gently, even warmly, even with the best intentions in the world, that is not love. That is their fear, and it is not yours to carry. She paused. I don't know yet what's going to happen. I don't know what your father and I... She stopped. She let herself sit with the not knowing. I don't know, but I know this. You are going to know who your mother is. You are going to see her be herself, all of herself. That is the one thing I am certain of. She cried then. Not desperate crying, not the crying of someone falling apart. The other kind. The kind that comes when you have finally been completely honest with yourself after a very long time of not being. Clean crying. The releasing of something rather than the expressing of it. She sat in the yellow room and she cried, and the baby was still and quiet and present. And when it was over, Clara felt scraped out and clear. More real than she had felt in 2 years. She hadn't understood until now how much energy it took to be less than yourself, how exhausting the constant slight reduction, how much of her had been spent on the management of her own smallness. That was over. She looked at the room she had built, the yellow walls, the mobile of small wooden stars she had assembled herself on a Sunday afternoon while Grant was traveling, the quilt from her mother, the books on the low shelf, the frame print above the changing table, a reproduction of a Georgia O'Keeffe painting, Bones and Light. She had built this room for her daughter. She was going to build everything else for both of them. Preston's warning played again in her mind. Build quickly, he had said. She pulled out her phone. 3:17 in the morning. She opened her notes. She had been documenting. She had a list of conversations, dates, the financial documents, the addendum photographs, the email thread from month 8 when Grant had said, "You don't have to rush back. The household needs you more than any company does. The household needs you, not I need you, not we need you, the household." She had been managed. She had been organized, like a holding, like an asset. I'm not crazy, she thought. I know exactly what I saw. I know exactly what was done. I have the documentation of all of it. Not one piece of this is my imagination. She closed the Notes app. She looked at the crescent moon nightlight. I am 7 months pregnant and alone in a nursery at 3 in the morning, and I am the most clear-headed I have been in 2 years, she thought. The hardest part was admitting I knew all along. Some part of me knew. The part I kept telling to be quiet, be patient, be generous, give it time. That part was right. She didn't need to be angry at herself for not listening sooner. She just needed to listen now. She rocked slowly in the chair her grandmother would have recognized, in the yellow room she had made herself, talking to the daughter who would know her whole. I promise you, she said softly, by the time you can understand this conversation, I will have done the work, so that you never look at your mother and wonder where she went. The baby moved, gently. As if in answer, she accepted the Callaway Research Partnership, not a consulting engagement anymore, a full partnership, her name on the project, her methodology at the center, a conference presentation in 4 months, and a publication track that Arthur had been holding space for because, in his words, he had been certain she would come back. She told Grant at dinner again. Same table, same chandelier, same careful geography of their shared life. I've accepted a full research partnership with Callaway, she said. It begins 6 weeks after the baby is born. Grant set down his fork. Clara. The gentle voice. The patient voice. We just talked about this. With a newborn. Yes, she said. With a newborn. Millions of women work with newborns. I have excellent support arranged. I have thought through every practical detail. I just think that the first year, Grant, she said his name the way she had learned to say it, clearly, without apology. I'm telling you, not asking. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her. She looked back. The table was very still. Something moved in his face, something complex she couldn't fully read. It was not anger. It was not entirely surprise. It was something that might have been, in another light, recognition. Okay, he said finally. Just okay. She nodded. She picked up her fork. They ate in silence. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of a situation that had shifted, and both people were feeling the new shape of it. She called her mother Helen, who had taught 6th grade in Ohio for 31 years, who raised 3 daughters in a 3-bedroom house and made it feel like abundance, who had never, not once, told any of her daughters to make themselves smaller for anyone. Mom, Clara said, I have things to tell you. Her mother listened. She did not interrupt. She said, in the specific way that meant, I already knew some of this, and I was waiting for you to know it too. When Clara finished, there was a pause. What do you need? Helen asked. I don't know exactly. Maybe just someone to know, someone who knew me before. Before, Helen said. Just the one word. And it landed differently from the way it had landed in the conference room corridor. Not diminishment. Continuity. I've been away from myself, Clara said. I know, her mother said. I watched it happen. I didn't want to push. You needed to find it yourself. Was it obvious from outside? A pause. It was noticeable, Helen said carefully. The way you got quieter at gatherings, the way you stopped saying what you thought until someone else said it first. Clara closed her eyes. I'm so... Don't apologize to me, Helen said firmly. I don't need an apology. I need you to come back. And it sounds like you are. I am. Good. Her mother's voice was warm and solid, the voice of a woman who had been a foundation for a very long time and was entirely comfortable being one. Come home in the spring. Bring my granddaughter. We'll come, Clara said. After she hung up, she sat for a long time with the phone in her hands. She thought about all the forms a mother takes, her own mother, steady and clear, her grandmother, competent and quiet, herself, figuring it out in real time. She thought about what she was building, not just a career, not just a case, a life. The actual shape of a life she wanted her daughter to see. She found the study one morning completely transformed. Not physically, she had made no changes. She sat at the desk and looked at the books on the shelves. Her books, back on shelves where they belonged, moved from boxes and closets over the past 3 weeks, and the annotated papers in their organized piles, and the notepad with its pages of handwriting that looked like herself. And she felt it. This room is mine. This is where I think. This is where I am. She opened the blank document on her laptop. She had been thinking about a paper, building it in the margins and corners of her days. A paper about what she was calling re-entry architecture, the structural and psychological barriers facing women who return to careers after domestic interruption. She knew the subject intimately. She began to write, not slowly, not carefully. The way she wrote when she was fully herself, fast and following the thought wherever it went, trusting that the shape would emerge. 2 hours later, she had 4,000 words. She sat back and read them. They were good. She had forgotten how good it felt to produce something real, something that would exist in the world, something with her name on it. Her name, Diane came to the house. Uninvited, as Diane always came. She found Clara in the study. She stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had come to rearrange furniture and found it bolted to the floor. "Clara," she said, "I think we should talk about what you're doing." Clara looked up from her work. She thought of all the things she might say, all the diplomatic, managed, careful responses she would have given 2 months ago. "Diane," she said, "come in." Diane came in. She sat in the chair across from the desk. She looked around at the transformed space. The books, the papers, the evidence of active, serious work, with an expression that she was trying to keep neutral. "I'm concerned," Diane said, "about what all of this means for Grant, for the family." "What specifically concerns you?" Clara asked. "This," Diane gestured at the room, "this project, this Callaway business, with a baby coming." "Other women manage," Clara said. "You're not other women," Diane said. "You're Grant's wife." Clara set down her pen. "I have been very patient, Diane," she said. Her voice was completely even. "I have been gracious at every event where you introduced me as the woman who keeps Grant happy. I absorbed every comment about schedules and households. I smiled through 2 years of being categorized instead of known." Diane's chin came up. "I was only trying to be helpful," Clara said. "I know. I understand that. I'm not disputing your intentions." She paused. "But I need you to understand something. I am a published researcher. I have a doctorate. I have work that has had real impact. And in 8 weeks, I'm going to give birth to a daughter who will know, from her first day of life, that her value is not measured by who she marries." She held Diane's eyes. "You are welcome in our lives. You are welcome with my daughter, but you will not walk into my study and question my choices, because what I am doing for this family is showing it what it should have valued all along." Silence. Diane opened her mouth. She closed it. She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She left. Clara listened to her heels on the marble floor, the front door, the soft hydraulic close of it. She turned back to her laptop. Her hands were steady. She started writing again. She and Grant had the conversation on a Sunday morning. She had chosen the time carefully. Not at dinner, not at an event, not in passing. Sunday morning, early, the house quiet, both of them in the kitchen with coffee and nowhere to be. She set the folder on the table in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. She sat down across from him. "I found the addendum," she said. "I know it exists. Harriet has confirmed it's not legally enforceable. I'm not here to fight about it." She paused. "I'm here because you need to know that I found it, and that I understand now the shape of what these 2 years have been." Grant looked at the folder. His jaw tightened. His expression moved through several things she watched carefully. "Clara, let me finish," she said, not unkindly, firmly. "I know you didn't set out to. I don't think there was a plan, exactly. I think you have a way of organizing the world that felt natural to you, that felt like care." She looked at him steadily. "But it was control, and the addendum tells me that somewhere in you, you knew you were building a structure I wouldn't have agreed to if you'd asked." He was quiet. "I'm not going to make this ugly," she said. "Not for my sake. Not for her sake." She touched her stomach briefly. "But I need you to see it clearly. What was done, what it cost." A long silence. "I didn't," he started. He stopped. "I know," she said. "That's the complicated part. You didn't intend it. The effect was the same." She folded her hands on the table. "I've restructured this household accounts, which is my right under the original prenuptial. I have a meeting with a family mediator next week, and I have accepted the Callaway partnership, which begins after the baby is born." He looked at her. She was not what he had expected. She could see that clearly. He had perhaps expected anger, tears, the confrontation with its familiar script. She was simply herself, clear, calm, whole. What do you want? He said finally. I want to make a decision, she said. A real one. About our marriage. With full information. For the first time. She stood. I think that's the least I'm owed, she said. Don't you? She picked up her coffee and walked to the window and looked at the park. He sat at the table behind her. After a long moment, he said, I didn't know what I was doing. I want you to believe that. She looked at the park, the winter bare trees. I do believe it, she said. That's the part that took me longest to accept, because if you knew, it would be simpler. She turned around. But not knowing doesn't mean it didn't happen. He looked at his hands. What do I do? He said. And his voice was different. The CEO voice was gone. The managing voice was gone. What was left sounded younger and genuinely uncertain. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Neither of us knows yet. But we're going to figure it out with open eyes. Both of us. The mediation process was not clean. Nothing real ever is. There were hard conversations. There were sessions where Grant reverted to form. The gentle logic, the reasonable management of her concerns, the subtle implication that she was processing things incorrectly. But Harriet was there, and Clara had 2 years of documentation, and she had herself fully in a way she had not had herself at the beginning of the marriage. He could not manage what he could not diminish, and she had stopped allowing the diminishment. There were also moments in the strange, suspended quality of those weeks that were not adversarial. Grant holding the baby at the ultrasound, his face going open and unguarded, in the way that reminded her why she had loved him. Dinner where they talked about her research, and he listened, actually listened, and asked questions that showed he understood. She thought, this is the man he could have been. This is the man I thought I was marrying. She didn't know yet if that man was enough, if what had been built and then systematically reduced could be rebuilt into something honest. She didn't need to know yet. She needed to know herself. That part was done. The night before the board meeting, she didn't know would change everything. She was in the nursery, yellow room, crescent moon, the weight of her daughter enormous and present, and almost here. Tomorrow Arthur is presenting at your father's company, she told her. He's going to cite my work, my name, in a room full of people who have known me for 2 years as someone else. She rocked slowly. I'm not going to do anything dramatic. I'm just going to be there. I'm going to let the truth be in the room. The baby moved. Long, slow, like a stretch. Your great-grandmother used to say that the truth doesn't need your help. It just needs the room cleared of everything else. She put her hands flat on her stomach. The room's been cleared, she said. She went to the board meeting because Arthur called the night before. He said, I should have told you sooner. I'm presenting a research segment at Whitfield Holdings' annual stakeholder meeting tomorrow. They have been using your methodology in their acquisition risk models, the work from your Chicago paper. I'm citing the original source. She was quiet for a moment. Who knows the source? She asked. No one there, I suspect, Arthur said. The internal reports reference the methodology without the author name, which is... He paused. Irregular. In my experience, attribution errors of that specificity are rarely accidental. Her name had been removed from her own work, used internally across 2 years of major acquisitions, generating results, generating savings, generating the kind of performance metrics a company puts in its annual stakeholder report. Her name removed. I have been in this field for 30 years, Arthur said. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. I have never presented someone's work without crediting them. I am not going to start tomorrow. She stood at the kitchen window. The park was dark. The city lights reflected in the glass. Thank you, she said. You should be there, he said. She thought about it for a long moment. Yes, she said. I should. She sat in the back of the boardroom. No one stopped her at the door. She was Clara Whitfield. This building had her husband's name on it, and her husband's name was everywhere. And for 2 years, she had been somewhere else entirely. She found a seat near the back. Aisle seat. She was 8 months pregnant, and she sat very straight, and she looked at the room. The board, senior leadership, partners, key stakeholders. She recognized most of them. She had smiled at most of them at events and dinners over 2 years. She had been introduced to most of them as Grant's wife. She folded her hands in her lap. Grant was at the front. He saw her as he was setting up. His expression shifted. Not anger, not displeasure, something more complicated. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away, and she watched him make the decision not to make anything of it. She appreciated that, in the moment. Whatever else was true, he understood the situation clearly enough to know that removing her would be worse than whatever was about to happen. The meeting proceeded. Grant presented. He was very good. This had never been in question. His command of the room, his precision, his ease with numbers and vision, and the particular optimism that made investors lean forward, these were real. She had never doubted his abilities. Then Arthur stood. He did not use slides. He spoke. The room's quality of attention shifted, the way it shifts for people who radiate authority without performing it. He outlined the behavioral economics framework that Whitfield Holdings had been using in acquisition risk assessment for the past 2 years. He described it precisely and completely. He explained the methodology, its applications, its results. He paused. I want to address attribution before I continue, he said. This framework was developed by Clara Rose Whitfield, née Barton, in her doctoral research at Georgetown University, refined and published in her paper, Incentive Architecture and Institutional Risk, in the year 2019. He paused again. Dr. Whitfield developed this methodology before joining this company's family. It is her intellectual work, and I want that clearly on record. He looked up from his notes. To be precise about the stakes of proper attribution, the application of this framework to Whitfield Holdings' acquisition strategy over the past 24 months has generated approximately $60 million in risk-adjusted savings. It is, in concrete and measurable terms, one of the most valuable intellectual contributions in this portfolio. He looked directly at Clara. I'm glad she could join us today. The room turned. Every head, not one at a time, together, the specific collective motion of a group realizing it has been missing information. $60 million. 2 years, her name. Clara sat in the back of the room, and she did not stand. She did not make a speech. She did not perform triumph. She sat quietly in her seat, with her hands folded over her daughter, and she let the room look at her. She let them see her. She saw Grant at the front of the room. She watched his face, the recalibration running behind his eyes. Not shame, not yet. That would come later, privately, in whatever form it took for a man like Grant. Right now it was recalibration. The rapid reassessment of a man who had spent 2 years looking at something without seeing it. He looked at her across the length of the room. She held his gaze, calmly, completely, without apology or performance or the slight pulling back she had spent 2 years training herself to do. She simply looked at him. He was the first to look away. After the meeting broke, Arthur walked to the back of the room. You handled that well, he said. I sat in a chair, she said. Sometimes, Arthur said. That is exactly the right thing to do. They walked out together. In the lobby, she saw several board members look at her differently, not all of them, not with warmth necessarily, but with a recalibrated regard, the particular look of people who are updating their understanding of a situation. Georgina, the senator's wife, was there. She had come as someone's guest. She found Clara near the elevator. She held out her hand. "I've been reading your work," she said, "since the gala last year, your paper on institutional incentive structures. It's extraordinary." Clara shook her hand. "Thank you," she said. Georgina held her gaze, the quick, reading eyes, something knowing in them. "I'm glad you're back," she said simply. She moved away. Clara stood in the lobby of the building that had her husband's name on it and thought, "I never left. I was here the whole time. I was just being looked at without being seen." Not anymore. Rose arrived on a Tuesday morning. Quickly, loudly, with every indication of being a person who had no interest in waiting for convenient timing. Clara held her and cried, and it was the largest crying she had ever done. Not grief, not relief exactly, something bigger than both of those. The feeling of arriving somewhere you have been traveling toward, and the traveling has been long, and the destination is better than you let yourself imagine. Grant held his daughter, and his face did something she had never seen it do in 2 years of marriage. It opened, completely. Every layer of management, every layer of performance, everything he had built to run a company and run a family, all of it fell away. He was just a man holding his daughter. She watched him, and she felt something complicated and real. Grief for what their marriage might have been if they had found each other honestly. Gratitude for what they had made. The particular sorrow of loving someone and understanding clearly, finally, that love is not always enough. "Rose," she said, because they had agreed on the name. Or rather, Clara had told him the name, and Grant had said, "Yes, that's right, Rose," after her grandmother, after every woman who ran everything quietly and made it look like simply living. The symposium. 3 months later, the National Behavioral Economics Conference, the largest in the country. Clara was on the program, not as a spouse, not as a guest, as a presenter. She stood backstage in the minutes before and thought about what this felt like. She was tired. She had a 3-month-old daughter at home with Bet, who had insisted with the specific force of someone who had been waiting 2 years to be useful. She'd had 40 minutes to get ready this morning. She was tired in the full, specific way of a woman who has more to hold than she expected and is holding all of it. Betty was in the 3rd row. She had sent a text when she found her seat. It said, "I am going to cry in front of 400 economists, and I am not sorry." Arthur introduced her. He was brief. He was exact. He said, "Dr. Clara Whitfield's research has been quietly reshaping institutional risk methodology for 15 years. Today, she is not quiet about it anymore." She walked to the podium. The room settled. 400 people, researchers, policymakers, the people who had been building on her foundations while she was somewhere else. She put her hands on the podium. She looked at the room. She was not nervous. The nerves had been burned away by everything that came before. What was left was something cleaner, simpler. The feeling of a person standing exactly in the place they are supposed to be standing. She thought of the corridor, the frosted glass, the cracked door, the word before. She was grateful for it now, not for the hurt, for the breaking open, for the moment the thing she had been pretending not to know became impossible to pretend any longer. The prison door had been unlocked all along. She had been her own warden, and in that corridor, something had shifted in the lock. She began. "How many of you," she said, "have made an intelligent, informed decision that you knew was against your own interest, and made it anyway, not out of ignorance, out of something harder to name?" Hands rose across the room, all over, economists, researchers, policymakers, all raising their hands. She nodded. "Good," she said. "Then you already understand the research, but that's after." Bet found her in the lobby. She hugged her the way she had hugged her since they were 22. The kind of hug that means, I see you, and I have always seen you, and I am so glad you see yourself now. You were, Bet started. Don't say brilliant. I was going to say yourself, Bet said. Completely, fully yourself, maybe for the first time in years. Clara was quiet. It felt like that, she said, like coming home. Which home? The real one, Clara said. The one that was always there. That evening, she was on the couch in what had become her apartment. She and Grant were navigating the separation carefully, honestly, in a way that was difficult and real, and nothing like what she had feared. He was 3 blocks away. He was in Rose's life every day. They were building something new from the wreckage of something old, and it was slow, and it was hard, and it was hers. Actually hers. Rose was in the bouncer on the floor, examining her hands. The complete scientific focus of a person encountering something extraordinary. Her own hands. The specific wonder of it. 17 messages on Clara's phone. Conference contacts. Research inquiries. A journalist wanting a comment for a piece on women returning to careers. A university asking if she would consider a fellowship. Tomorrow. Tonight, she was eating pasta from the container and watching her daughter discover her own hands and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could name, entirely at ease in her own life. Your great-grandmother would have loved you, she told Rose. Rose looked up at the sound of her voice. Those eyes, steady, watchful, already the kind of person who notices everything. Yeah, Clara said softly. You're going to be just fine. She had thought the boardroom was the end of the story. She understood now that it wasn't. The boardroom was a moment, important, true. The room going still, the heads turning, the names spoken clearly in the place where it had been erased. But the story was this. The pasta, and the daughter, and the work waiting on her laptop. The mediations still ongoing and imperfect and real. The grief that came some evenings for the marriage she had wanted to have and had not quite managed to build. The friendship with Bet that had held through everything. The phone calls with her mother. The yellow room 3 blocks away that Rose would grow up sleeping in. The story was the woman who lost herself gradually, in small daily erosions, and found herself the same way, gradually, in small daily choices. She had thought starting over felt impossible. She understood now that she hadn't started over. She had started correctly. The difference was everything. Rose made a sound, small, serious, satisfied. She had figured out her hands. She held both of them up, studying them with the expression of someone who has solved a problem they have been working on for some time. Clara watched her. That's what it feels like, she said quietly. When something becomes clear, hold on to that. Rose looked at her, those eyes, steady, open, already themselves. Outside, the city was full of its ordinary evening sounds. Traffic and voices, and the particular alive noise of a place where millions of things are happening at once. Somewhere 3 blocks away, Grant was learning to be a father in the way you learn anything important. Imperfectly, with full effort. Somewhere in Ohio, Helen was probably grading papers or making tea or doing one of the 10,000 ordinary things that constituted a life well lived. Somewhere Arthur Calloway was reading something and making notes in the margins. The world was large and interconnected and full of work that mattered. Clara Whitfield was in it, not at the edges of it, not as an appendage to it, in it, fully. Her name on things, her work in the room, herself. She had been afraid for 2 years that she had gone too far, lost too much. that the distance back to herself was longer than she could travel. She understood now what she should have understood then. You don't travel back to yourself. You don't go back at all. You go forward into who you have become, all of it, including the years you were less than yourself, and you carry it with you. Not as damage, as information. She had spent her career studying why intelligent people make choices that betray themselves. Now she understood it from the inside, and she was going to write about it. The paper was already half written. It was going to be the best work she had ever done, because the best research comes from the questions that cost you something. And this one had cost her everything, and she was still here. Her name was still her name, and she was ready. Rose yawned, a small, enormous yawn, the total commitment of a creature who does everything completely. I know, Clara said. She put down the pasta. She crossed the room. She picked up her daughter. Rose settled against her chest with the confident ease of someone who has always known where home is. Clara stood at the window with her daughter and looked at the city, the lights coming on as the evening deepened. The park she could see, from here, bare-limbed and dark and quietly itself. She thought of her grandmother's kitchen, yellow light, screen door. She thought of the podium, the room going still. She thought of the corridor, the frosted glass, the cracked door. Before, someone had said. Yes, Clara thought now. Before, and after, and everything in between. And still here, still completely, entirely, irrevocably here.
Before I let you go, I want to sit with you for just a moment, because Clara's story is not just a story, it is a mirror. And I think you already knew that when you started listening. Here is what I want you to carry with you. The most dangerous kind of loss is the kind that happens quietly, not in one dramatic moment, not in a single decision you can point to and say, there, that is where it happened. It happens in small surrenders. One pause, one deferral. One time you finished your sentence inside your own head because someone else's voice was louder. One morning you woke up and realized you had been adjusting yourself for so long that you couldn't remember what you looked like when you weren't adjusting. That is what happened to Clara, and that is what happens to far more women than anyone talks about openly. Here is the first lesson. Erosion is not the same as destruction. A stone that has been shaped by water for years is not ruined. It is changed. But the stone is still there. The substance is still there. What water does, what time does, what 1,000 small surrenders do, is reveal a shape, sometimes a shape you didn't know you had. Clara did not lose herself. She lost access to herself. Those are different things. And the way back is not dramatic. It is not one confrontation or one moment of triumph. It is a series of small reclamations. A morning you get up early and read something that matters to you. A phone call you make to the person who knew you before. A sentence you finish out loud instead of inside your own head. Small, consistent, yours. Here is the second lesson. Real love does not ask you to disappear. This is the thing Clara had to learn at the highest possible cost. And I say this not to place blame, because Grant is not a villain, and Clara is not a victim in the simple sense, but to say something true that we do not say clearly enough. A person can love you genuinely and still diminish you. A person can mean well and still build a structure that keeps you small. Intention does not cancel effect. The question to ask, in any relationship, in any room, in any situation, is not, does this person mean to limit me? The question is, do I leave this person more myself or less myself? That is the only metric that matters. Here is the third lesson. The hardest part is admitting you knew. Clara knew. Some part of her knew from almost the beginning. The part she kept telling to be quiet, to be patient, to be generous, to give it time. We all have that part. The part that notices. The part that files things away because we are not ready to look at them directly. That part is not weakness. That part is not stupidity. That part is the self. Still present, still watching, still keeping records even when you have told it to stop. When you are ready, it will show you everything. You will find the folder, You will read the document. You will sit on the floor for a moment. And then you will stand up. You will photograph every page. You will make your calls. You will begin, not over, again. There is a difference. Starting over means from nothing. Starting again means from everything you already are. Clara named her daughter Rose, after her grandmother, the woman who ran everything quietly and made it look like simply living. She stood at a podium 3 months later and said one sentence to a room of 400 people. And the room went with her. Not because she was new, because she was fully herself. That is what presence actually is. Not performance, not confidence in the loud sense, just the complete occupation of who you are. We spend so much of our lives in partial occupation, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, the version of ourselves that is acceptable in this room, the version that doesn't take up too much space, the version that finishes sentences inside her own head. What if you occupied yourself completely? What if you let your name be in the room all the way in, no apology, no pulling back? What would change? Everything, I think. Everything. So here is what I want to leave you with. You were real before you were anyone's wife, before you were anyone's mother, before you were anyone's anything. You were a person with a name and a mind and work that mattered. You still are. The prison door has been unlocked all along. You were just never told. Now you know. If this story speaks to something you have felt, something you have lived, share it with one woman who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And leave a comment below, because your words matter here, and I read every single one. Final closing note. This content was researched, developed, and carefully crafted by hand, built with intention to bring meaning, healing, and the kind of truth that stays with you long after the story ends. Every word was chosen not for algorithm, not for formula, but for the woman who needed to hear it today. We hope it found her.